Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to dive deep into a text that, we all think we know, the very first chapter of Genesis. But we're going to push aside all the noise from the modern science versus religion debates for a minute. We're here to uncover what this ancient text actually is. And it's not a science textbook. It's something far more profound. It's a poetic manifesto, a kind of cosmic song sung in defiance of chaos. So here's our plan. First, we'll set the stage, looking at the chaotic world Genesis was actually responding to. Then, we're going to uncover its hidden, beautiful literary structure. After that, we'll decode its powerful symbols, explore the amazing idea of creation by the spoken word, and finally, we'll see why this ancient poem still echoes with so much relevance for us today. All right, so to really get Genesis 1, you have to do a little time traveling. Not to the beginning of the universe, but to the world in which this text was actually written. And you have to understand, that world was already full of big, powerful stories about creation. And honestly, they were pretty dark, violent, and chaotic. On one side, you have the blockbuster story of the ancient world, something like the Babylonian Enuma Elish. In that story, the world is literally carved out of the dead body of a goddess after a nasty war between the gods. And humanity? We're just an afterthought, made from the blood of some lesser god to be slaves for the real gods. It's a universe that is fundamentally born from conflict. And then, Genesis 1 walks onto the stage and just flips the whole table over. It says no. A single good God speaks, and reality just unfolds. There's no war, there's just a voice. Humanity isn't an accident made for slavery. We are the grand finale, the very pinnacle of creation, made in God's own image. This world isn't some cosmic accident of violence. It's a deliberate, beautiful act of goodness and love. You see, Genesis 1 wasn't written in a peaceful library. It was likely pieced together during the Babylonian exile. So just picture this. You're an Israelite, your home has been destroyed, your temple is gone, and you're a captive in an empire that tells you day in and day out that the universe is violent and you are worthless. In that context, Genesis 1 becomes this incredible act of spiritual resistance. It's a defiance song, a manifesto that shouts, no, that is not our story. Our God is a God of order and love. The universe is fundamentally good, and we have dignity, even here, in this place of despair. It was a song of hope, being sung in a very dark and foreign land. Now, this is where it gets really cool. The text doesn't just tell you its message, it shows you with its very structure. This isn't just a random shopping list of things being made. It's a masterpiece of literary design, built like a magnificent cosmic temple, where every single piece is in its perfect place. So right off the bat, we see the familiar 7 days. Now, the number 7 in the ancient world wasn't just, the number after 6. It symbolized wholeness, completion, perfection. And the text is built on this rhythm, this repetition. And God said, and it was so, and God saw that it was good. It's not lazy writing. It's a mantra. It creates this liturgical feel, like we're all taking part in a grand cosmic worship service. But there's an even deeper structure hiding in plain sight. Check this out. The first 3 days are all about forming the different realms of existence. On day 1, you get the realm of light and time. Day 2, the realm of the sky and the seas. Day 3, the realm of the land. Okay, simple enough. But then look at the next 3 days. They're about filling those exact same realms in the exact same order. Day 4 fills day 1's realm with the sun, moon, and stars. Day 5 fills day 2's realms with birds and fish. And day 6 fills day 3's realm with land animals and us, humanity. It's this perfect, elegant symmetry. This tells us that the main point of creation here isn't making stuff out of nothing, but bringing beautiful order out of chaos, what the text calls the tohu vavohu, the formless and void. Theologian N.T. Wright just nails it when he describes this. He frames creation not as a construction project, but as the inauguration of a great temple. In this view, the universe itself is the sacred space where God lives. Every star, every mountain, they're all liturgical pieces. And humanity, created last, is placed in this temple as its priest, meant to care for this sacred space. So let's go even deeper, because in a poetic text like this one, every element is so much more than just a physical object. It's a powerful, archetypal symbol. It's got layers of meaning that speak not just to the world out there, but to the world in here, inside of us. The very first thing created is light, or or in Hebrew. But hang on, this isn't just the photons from a sunrise. Remember, the sun doesn't even show up until day 4. So what is this? This is a primordial, archetypical light. It symbolizes the dawn of consciousness itself, the very principle of order and awareness waking up in the darkness. It's the first act of knowing, of seeing, that makes everything else possible. And what about the waters? The text describes them as the deep, the abyss, this vast, chaotic sea of pure potential. Psychologically, it's a perfect symbol for the unconscious mind. It's formless, it's powerful, it contains everything, but it's not yet ordered. And what's so crucial here is that God doesn't destroy the chaotic waters. He separates them, he organizes them, he brings structure to the unformed. It's a way of saying that even the chaotic parts of life aren't evil. They're just raw material waiting for a creative word to give them shape. And this is where a thinker like Augustine of Hippo just blows your mind. He points out that this cosmic drama is also a deeply personal one. The story of the universe being created is a mirror for how order is created inside the human soul. That let there be light moment, that's also the moment spiritual awareness is born inside the chaos of our own minds and hearts. The cosmos and the soul, they are two versions of the same divine project. So this brings us to the very engine of the whole text, the driving force behind this entire cosmic symphony. It's this beautiful and, at the time, absolutely radical idea that reality itself isn't born from a fight or from magic, but simply from a voice. The phrase that you hear again and again and again, "and God said," is probably the most important line in the whole chapter. This is what some philosophers call a performative speech act, which is really just a fancy way of saying that the words themselves do the thing. They don't just describe a reality that's already there. The act of speaking creates the reality. When God says, "Let there be light," the speaking is the becoming. This is an incredible statement about the nature of reality itself, that it is grounded in a voice, in meaning, in a divine word. I love this image from the early church father Irenaeus of Lyon. He said that God creates with two hands, the Word and the Spirit. Just think about that for a second. The Father speaks the Word, the divine idea, the intention, and at the same exact time the Spirit, the Ruach, which is Hebrew for wind or breath, is hovering over the waters, bringing that word to life. It's this beautiful dance. The divine mind speaks, and the divine breath makes it real. And how does this incredible symphony finally conclude? You'd expect a giant finale, right? A final, massive bang. Nope. It ends with the exact opposite, with rest. The seventh day, the Sabbath, is the climax of the story. God stops his work not because he's tired, but to enjoy it, to bless it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer saw this as the very foundation of what it means to be human. He said we're called not just to do and to make, but to stop, to cease, and to join in God's own rhythm of rest. It's in that holy pause that the goodness of it all is truly sealed. Okay, so this is all really fascinating as ancient literature, but why should we care? Why does this poetic manifesto matter to us right now, living in our noisy, chaotic digital age? Well, the answer is, it might matter more than ever before. First, it's really important to see that we are not the first people to wrestle with this text. For 2,000 years, some of the greatest minds in history have engaged with Genesis 1. From Origen, who saw it as an allegory for the soul, to Augustine, who argued the days were logical categories, not 24-hour periods, all the way to Karl Barth, who called creation the theater of God's glory. The point is, the tradition has always understood this text as a deep well of theological wisdom, not a flat, literal story. Now, let's bring it right home. We live in a new kind of Babel, don't we? We are just bombarded by a constant stream of information, notifications, opinions, distractions. The digital noise is absolutely deafening. So in the middle of all that overwhelming chaos, how on earth do we find the signal? Where is the clarity? Well, Genesis calls us back to a foundational principle. It says that beneath all the static, beneath all the noise, there is a loving, ordering voice that is still speaking reality into being. The spiritual practice this text invites us into is to quiet our own internal chaos, just long enough to hear that creative word again, the voice that can bring structure and meaning and light to our own inner formless and void. And what about our work? Our modern culture, it worships at the altar of relentless productivity. We feel this pressure to always be on, to be hustling, to measure our very worth by our output. We live in this state of constant low-grade anxiety, absolutely terrified of stopping, terrified of being seen as unproductive. The climax of Genesis 1 offers a radical cure for this. The Sabbath is the exorcism of anxiety. The command to rest is not about taking a nap. It is a profound act of faith. It is a weekly declaration that our value is not based on what we produce. It's trusting that the universe will keep spinning, that God's good order is holding it all together even when we let go. It's the ultimate act of faith. And maybe the greatest secret of Genesis 1 is that it's not really about something that happened in the beginning. Creation isn't just a past event, it's a continuous, unfolding present. This ancient text is an invitation to believe that even now, right now, the Spirit is hovering over the chaotic waters of our world and of our lives. And that even now, the creative word is being spoken, just waiting for us to listen, ready to say once again into our own darkness, let there be light.